Hi, I'm Bill Crystal. Welcome back to Conversations. I'm very pleased to be joined, I think for the fourth time, by Scott Lincicome, Vice President for Economics and Trade at Cato, at the Cato Institute, a weekly columnist now for the Dispatch, which I really highly recommend. Scott's weekly analysis of economics in general, a lot of emphasis on trade, which is what we're going to talk about today, trade and tariffs. We did three conversations back in the before times, I believe, with Scott, and they're very much worth listening to still. A couple pandemic related on supply. You were good on the supply chain. You saw those problems with the supply chain stuff a little before President Biden did, honestly, and that was prescient of you. And also, I think the original conversation we did, which was just really the case for was the case for free trade. If only more people had paid attention to that, maybe we wouldn't. But then we wouldn't have the excuse for this conversation, which is about the tariffs, and we're having it on, what are we on? August 7th, which is the day, actually, if I'm not mistaken, the tariffs come into effect, right? So very well timed. So I want to get into, and you were a lawyer who dealt with all this stuff in business, and I really am interested in getting beyond some of the general economic stuff. We've discussed that with others, Larry Summers, Jason Furman, to the sort of how it works in practice. What do producers do? What do consumers do? What are some of the less obvious effects of this new world we're entering, I guess? But I guess we should begin with a quick sort of scene setting of just where are we? What is this new world? I read earnestly tried to read up on it last night, and 10% for everyone, but then there's more for some people. Then there are carve outs for these kinds of goods, but it could be 100% on this if Trump changes his mind about. I mean, it's kind of confusing, I would say.
It's confusing even for those of us who are paid to follow it, quite frankly. We are at Cato right now trying to put together an entire website on trade complexity because it's gonna have these massive files and all these data visualizations because it is really, really complicated. I think the best place to start is at the beginning. In very late January, President Trump announced kind of the opening salvo of tariffs on Canadian, Mexican, and Chinese imports on the grounds of a national emergency related to fentanyl. Shortly thereafter, he jacked up his own steel and aluminum tariffs quite substantially, not just in terms of the tariff going from 10 or 25% to 50%, but also expanding the number, or eliminating the exclusions and exemptions for certain countries for certain products and expanding them to other products downstream in the steel supply chain. So if you think of things like aluminum baseball bats are now covered by aluminum tariffs. Then was the big shot, the reciprocal tariffs. You had a very complicated set of tariff rates for countries supposedly based on their unfair trade practices or their tariff walls and non-tariff barriers. Turned out, though, it was really just a very rudimentary calculation based on bilateral trade balances. And that was in April. Right around the same time, the president imposed tariffs on automotive goods, cars, parts, and the rest, based on an investigation that was completed during his first term, but never actually implemented. Tisk tisk Joe Biden for not actually terminating that thing entirely. So now we're stuck with car tariffs, even though, again, the data on which that was based are 5 years old or so. The reciprocal tariffs, the big ones in April, elicited a bit of a market panic. Everybody looked at these rates going up to almost 50% and saw that it was going to be a potential trade war. Stocks sold off. We all remember this quite frantic period. And the day after the tariffs were implemented, Trump backed off and paused them for 90 days, allowing for a bunch of trade deal negotiations, promising us 90 deals in 90 days. Now, we didn't get that, unsurprisingly. But since then, we've gotten a few deals. We've gotten another pause that just ended today. And the result is a really complicated set of tariffs. So you have tariffs on different products, cars, aluminum. Now we've got maybe semiconductors. Copper is another one. So you have these product-specific tariffs. You have country-specific tariffs, widely varying from anything from 10% to almost 50%. And you have a bunch of carve-outs and exemptions and exclusions for various products. Again, just yesterday, Trump said that he was going to exclude from the semiconductors tariffs if things like Apple smartphones, because Apple's investing in America. So there's all these exemptions and exclusions, but also expansion. So I mentioned the derivatives, the kind of the aluminum baseball bat. But now, if you're importing a product that has content, aluminum content, steel content, you have to figure out how much content that is, and then pay a tariff on that amount of content. So there's all these new rules. So in just the span of, now we're at 7 months, we've gone from a US trade regime that was pretty simple. We had some, some tariffs here, we had some free trade agreements there, but it's pretty easy, to one that is really insanely complex. And of course, tariff rates are on average now 3 to 4 times what they were in January, and they'll only go higher from here. We were at around 3% during the Biden years. We're now at about 9 to 10% effective rate. Will go to 15 or so in the next few weeks as all of these tariffs kick in and imports start to arrive.
That's really helpful. I mean, I think most of the discussion from the economists has been on the sort of macro level of what a 10 or 12% rate means, as opposed to a 3% rate. And most of them don't think it's great for the country. But
Yeah.
maybe we'll just put that aside, and we'll come back to it, obviously, as we go through, especially when we get to some of the regions, China, Canada, Europe, maybe near the end of the conversation. But I really think what I learned so much from talking to you is sort of thinking about it at a more micro level in a way. If you're a producer here, I mean, one thinks of it as we're slapping it on these people abroad. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. Depends what your views on free trade are and how that all washes out. But it's sort of the problem is for the foreign companies, right? The problem is for the
Right.
French wine maker. He's going to have to pay tariffs, and maybe that's bad for the consumer here. That's kind of the typical discussion. But I think what you've done so much work on, and you have real experience with, is how it affects not just consumers here, and I want to get back to that too, but producers. So large and small and so forth. So maybe, I mean, what is it really like? Okay, you're running a small
Yeah.
business here, or you're running a huge business here. How does this regime affect you?
Yeah, so there's some good and a lot of bad. Some of the good is that producers were very smart in the sense that they saw all the tariffs coming, and they effectively imported like crazy to build up inventories that were tariff free. And one of the reasons why the economic effects of the tariffs have been more muted and delayed, why the freak out in April didn't immediately translate to kind of the hard economic data showing this kind of collapse in economic activity, was a big reason for that was because of all of these efforts that businesses had made to avoid tariffs, which is, that's trade 101, is that everybody's going to try to avoid the new taxes. Well, it's econ 101, really. They're going to try to avoid taxes any way they can. So that was a good short-term fix. Unfortunately, of course, that runs out. And one of the things that makes these tariffs different from the Trump 1.0 tariffs, and I think this is really important actually, is that the Trump 1.0 tariffs, they had their problems, but they took about 2 years from announcement to implementation. There was an investigation. There was formal notice and comment. When the tariffs get expanded for China, producers, importers, everybody could say their piece, and maybe the tariff lists would change. So everybody had a ton of notice. They had a ton of say. This time around, no such thing.
And they could plan, and they could
Right, exactly. They could start to rework their supply chains, or you could even get an exclusion for just a year because you're moving your supply chains. We don't have any of that this time. This time around, for some of these tariffs, like the China tariffs that went from 30 to 150% during the whole U.S.-China kind of when we thought things were going to get really bad. That took a couple days. So this goes back to why for businesses this is so the bad side of it. You can't plan for 130% tariffs that are enacted in a week. So from a business perspective, you need to start with what are businesses importing and how are they importing them? So I always say this, about half of everything we import in the United States are actually manufacturing inputs. These are things used by American manufacturers to make other stuff. And oftentimes they're from the manufacturer's own affiliates abroad. So Airbus has a factory here in the United States. Airbus is not importing from some random European aircraft manufacturer. It's importing from Airbus in France and in Europe. So these types of transactions are entered into months in advance. You have to qualify your suppliers for highly regulated products like aircraft or cars, and you have to get sign off by the regulator. You have to check to see if it works, do all this stuff. So you're entering into these deals months, if not years ahead. So an immediate tariff on this product, it just you're screwed. There's no way to get around it once your inventories run out, right? So the first issue is simply, I can't just move my supply chain overnight. I have these deals, and oh, by the way, moving the supply chain is going to require qualifying a new supplier and doing all this type of stuff. So that's one big issue. Another big issue, though, is once you're importing the product, you have to uh, figure out what the tariff is. So again, back in the olden days, this was a very easy thing. You had your supplier, you set up your supply chain, you maybe went to the customs department and even asked for a customs ruling to determine what the product is in the tariff code to get your tariff rate, and then you're done. That's it. You import from there, you make your products, you sell your products here, whatever. Well, that's all out the window, right? So now,
Just to be clear, because I mean, the business here has the responsibility of figuring out
yeah,
and paying the tariff. The French wine manufacturer is unhappy if he's going to sell less wine, I
right,
suppose, in the U.S., but he's shipping the same wine in the same container to the same person. It's the importer
exactly.
here,
It's
whether that's a huge liquor company or a wine store, that has
yeah,
the
exactly.
responsibility of paying the tariff and figuring out the appropriate tariff, as it were, and paying it.
Right. So
So the
the
administrative
importers
burden is here, is what I'm saying. Yeah.
exactly. Importers are always liable for paying tariffs and for all the paperwork and the legal liability. So they're the importer of record. They are the ones that if something goes wrong, it's the Department of Justice or Customs knocking on their door. They're not going to the French winemaker or the Chinese widget maker. It's always they're going to the US based entity. So um, these companies have to suddenly figure out, well, what is the tariff rate for this product? There are there's a base rate that's in our tariff code that Congress actually set. Shocking, that Congress is involved given their constitutional authority over trade, right? But then you have to think, okay, well, we have the reciprocal tariff, and then is there metal in it? I have to determine the metal content. Um, are there any exceptions or exclusions that I can qualify for? Am I in a foreign trade zone and are there special rules for that? So this has suddenly become an incredibly complicated process, and one that I'm thankfully starting to see stories in Bloomberg and elsewhere about how importers have no idea what they're in for. They customs brokers whose livelihoods are this have no idea. The customs officials haven't sent formal guidance codifying how you determine all this stuff because they don't know either. So you can take relatively simple products like a toaster. Vice President Vance loves toasters. And suddenly importing a toaster from Vietnam was a really easy thing. Now you have to you have to figure out what's the Vietnam rate, what's the metals content, are any of the parts from Vietnam coming from China? Because that's another rule. Now Chinese content, the administration wants to apply additional tariffs on what they call transshipment. It's actually not the legal definition of transshipment, which is just slapping a different label on something and sending it off fraudulently. So suddenly overnight, importing that stuff has become an incredibly difficult hassle. And for small importers, so for big guys, it's a pain, but they'll figure it out. GM, Ford, Airbus, they pay a lot of people a lot of money to do this stuff. And they can enact very complex tariff mitigation strategies. So they have factories all over the world. Um, they can start using a different factory. They can maybe bring some stuff back onshore to the United States and then offshore some other stuff to kind of balance it out. They have a lot of things they can do. For little guys, this is crisis times because they have one supplier overseas. And by the way, it's their intellectual property. They are not actually buying from a manufacturer. They're using a contract manufacturer. So they enter into a deal with a contract and they get their product. So now their entire business model is shot. They don't have the money for really expensive trade compliance officials. And heaven forbid they get it wrong and they receive not only a big tariff bill, which now they're paying, they used to be paying $5,000, they're now paying $150,000 on their imports. But if they get a fine, that could be double that, right? And so those situations and we're just starting to see this ripple through. And then, the kicker on all of this is the termination of this de minimis exception, which, as anybody who's watching has imported from Amazon or Shein, Temu, or a lot of other places, and you've gotten a package directly in the mail and it has like Chinese writing on it or something. Well, that's the de minimis exception. So for a long time, Congress had said that.
So this is on the consumer side now.
Yeah. Direct to consumer. Right.
Direct
right.
to consumer. Yeah.
Yeah. But not really, because a lot of businesses use this too.
I see.
So I'm
they
actually
get stuff.
sticking with the businesses. Yeah. So a lot of businesses would do this too. So suddenly businesses are, and this is not just manufacturers or like your local auto parts guy or repairman who needs a certain part. A lot of businesses in the United States, online e-sellers, so people who are like, have a side gig on Etsy or on eBay. So a lot of these folks utilize the de minimis rule for very small dollar individual packages, and they'd get these shipments directly, and they avoided not just the duties, but all of the complexities involved. So now they're having to not just pay tariffs, but having to figure out all of the formal rules for customs compliance. So we've gone really almost overnight from a simple regime that allowed a relatively free flow of goods, with tariffs or not, to a really complex and opaque one. And one that I should note is just so ripe for gaming and evasion and all this type of stuff, right? Because as you increase tax complexity of any type, you increase the incentive for people to try to avoid the taxes or to smuggle, right? And so there are actually some good economic studies out there that show that, for every 1 percentage point you increase tariff or tariff complexity, you actually can lose 10, 20 cents of tariff revenue because people are trying to avoid those tariffs or legally or illegally.
Yeah, so I think this is so interesting because I think the complexity, the administrative burden side of it, the unpredictability side, which I guess is slightly different but related, having to hedge against that, right? All of that just is different. One can imagine a world in which tariffs go from 3% to 10%. I think most economists, not just at Cato, but people teaching Act 10 at Harvard would say it's not good net. That's going to hurt the economy. I think didn't one study recently show maybe a 0.4% drop of GDP, which sounds like, well, 4%, 0.4, you can live with that. But 0.4 is a big drop if you're going from 2.4 to 2. That's like, what is that? That's 20% drop in your annual GDP growth. That's not good. But that's one thing, and you could say a word about that too if you want. Obviously, that'd be great. But also, it sounds like what you're saying, though, is that the complexity, administrative burden, all the unpredictability, all in could do as much damage or even more. And also that we haven't seen that yet. Is that right? That's hard to figure out you can't just have a number on that now, right?
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that has been a bit frustrating, and I get it, but it's been a bit frustrating, is so much of the discussion is based on these rather elegant models of trade and trade flows and tariffs. And these are folks that I like a lot, Tax Foundation, Yale Budget Lab, and the rest. They do amazing work. But you just you type in the numbers and it spits you out another number and then you report on the number. And those are useful to show kind of the macro effects, but they don't capture all of this, all of the duck's feet paddling under the surface of the water. And the duck's feet are real people. And those things might show up in the aggregate economic statistics eventually. My guess is that the uncertainty certainly will, and some of the complexity will, and will somebody will be very smart and figure out a way to quantify this and study it. They always do. But we also shouldn't just lose sight of the fact that for a lot of people, this is their livelihoods, and who cares if it shows up in the aggregate economic statistics? As of January, they were operating a profitable, healthy, totally legal business that importing, producing, selling, whatever. And almost overnight, their business model has collapsed. And it hasn't collapsed based on this very rigorous and thoughtful process that went through the usual checks and balances of our government and all that. It was just a dude in the White House with a pen saying tariff, and changing that repeatedly and giving carve outs to his buddy Tim Apple because the guy gave him an award in the Oval Office, and that's I can't even imagine how those folks are and again, I'm happy to see that the media are starting to report on this. There have been a couple really good pieces in the last week or so about smaller businesses that are, sleepless nights for these American small business owners, franchises going out of business, that type of stuff. And that's real life. And we don't, if you talk only about GDP and jobs numbers at the aggregate level, you miss all of that. And I think that's as important, if not, quite frankly, more so, given the stakes.
And do you think that, and I guess that's really hitting now, or it's been hitting for a while,
Yeah.
but now they're facing the real future. And do you expect it to have, I mean, will we see actual stores be going out of business before Christmas because importing the little, gizmos for the Christmas trees suddenly is both too expensive? But I said maybe, as you say, most of the reporting still has been on the expense, but maybe it's also more the idea of having to deal with, as you say, no de minimis exceptions for the little, Christmas tree objects, and suddenly accounting for all this and figuring out how to avoid breaking the law. Maybe you just think, it's not worth it, right? I'll just,
Exactly. No, and I think you are starting to see that. I think we'll see more of it. We had this rather wonderful explosion in independent small businesses after so business formation, we call it, during the pandemic. It was one of the silver linings of the pandemic, was that people who were thrown out of their jobs for whatever reasons decided to start their own businesses, and we saw this. A good chunk of those were these types of e-commerce businesses, and for many of these folks now, again, that business model doesn't work anymore. The numbers don't work. So I do think we'll be seeing that. Be seeing more of that in the months ahead. If you, on an anecdotal level,
yeah.
a lot of stories from the spring and summer were, I have enough inventory to get me through the summer. I'm just hanging on to see where things end up. Um, this one's depressing. I've taken out a loan to get me through, just hope in the hope that we can get through this. But yeah, at some point, that's going to run out. And that goes back to, the other thing that's so different for smaller businesses is they don't have access to capital like the big guys do, right? They can't like issue more stock or go draw on their massive line of credit. For these, they issue new debt. They can't do that. So for them, they take out a second mortgage. They or get a small business loan from the bank, and when that's over, if they're still not able to get back into the black, then yeah, that's the end.
I mean, presumably some of them call their local member of Congress, and if a bunch of them get together, which they would have maybe be local chambers of commerce and so forth, that would capture, be able to aggregate some of these complaints and stories. But of course, I mean, but I don't know. None of this is really susceptible to that normal congressional lobbying. Well, it could be, but it's
Exactly.
not.
Well,
Yeah.
yes, just last week at Cato, we did an event with Senators Kane and Paul, and they brought up
Yeah,
that
I wanted to. I couldn't make that. I was in New York or something. Yeah, that was at the event, Whiskey and Wine or something. That seemed like a
yeah,
good.
it was great.
That was a very not your usual DC think tank event. I'm
Yeah,
going to
it's
say.
fun.
Yeah.
So we talked about trade, but also how it affects their local whiskey and wine industries. We had, a whiskey and wine tasting after. You'd be unsurprised to hear that it was a packed event
Yeah, I was about to say,
because
but a lot of people
yeah,
who don't normally show up at those
yeah,
long speeches.
overflow capacity for free booze. Big surprise in Washington. But so both of them brought up the small business angle. They said they're hearing from their
Mhm.
constituents. There have been legislative proposals to exempt small businesses from the tariffs entirely. Those have gone nowhere. But this gets to, one of the other big problems with the tariff regime is that it is all executive authority. It is all unilaterally imposed by the White House, basically. And that happened the first time around, but again, the first time around we had much more of an administrative process. Department of Commerce, the United States Trade Representative did their thing. This time, because they're using a different law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, this goes back to this national emergency declarations. The president says he has the right to do this without any investigation or anything. He can change them. He can do whatever he wants. Um, and that leaves Congress out. It eliminates all the due process and notice and stuff that we already talked about. But the other thing is that it really runs into this classic delegation of powers problem, is that once Congress gives its power to the president, it is really hard to get it back because you can have 52 votes in the Senate overturning the national emergency related to Canadian fentanyl smuggling. Eye roll there,
Mhm.
intentional. And it won't go anywhere because the House will block it with a procedural, or even if the House does something, then the president can veto it. Then you need veto-proof majorities, and that's 2/3 of both chambers. And good luck getting 2/3 of both chambers in this environment to even say that the sky is blue, no less to overturn the president's signature initiative. So that creates a huge problem for any sort of legislative fixes here. Something that we've been warning about at Cato for now going on a decade. And I think one of the real disappointments of the Biden era is that there was a brief moment where it did look like some of these reform initiatives were going to move, and they died in 2021. And so now for these emergency tariffs, our last hope are the courts. That the courts have never really ruled on whether the president can enact global tariffs under the IEPA. There are very strong arguments that he can't. The law doesn't mention tariffs ever. If the president can do all this with tariff rates, the delegation is overbroad, and the courts, especially the Supreme Court, don't like that. So there's a chance that a lot of these tariffs, not all of them, but a lot of them are overturned in the coming year, which is good in the sense that they go away, but it increases the uncertainty. So,
Right.
right, these tariffs are supposed to encourage more investment in the United States, but who's going to build a factory, spend millions, if not billions of dollars on a 30-year investment if the reason you're being compelled to do this goes away in 8 to 12 months? We're expecting the Federal Circuit to issue a ruling this month, but then it has to go to the Supreme Court, and that could take it could go into like June of next year. So that's one, I think, the uncertainty is a big issue. The other big issue, though, um, is the White House might have to refund, the government might have to refund all these duties um, if they're illegally collected. And there are already people are starting to wonder, will Trump even do it? Right? Will he pull a, now make them enforce it move? Um, will they try to say it only applies to the small businesses that sued, not to all of the duties that were collected illegally? So there's all sorts of wrinkles there too. But that's both raises, constitutional crisis situation stuff, but also it raises just practical issues with you could have a situation where importers are getting big refund checks, but they've already passed on costs to consumers, to you and me, and then what, right? So super weird economic effects could be in there as well.
And on the consumer side, I've heard stories anecdotally. You must know more than I have. The de minimis exception, which used to, I gather, to make it simple-minded, if one ordered something from a foreign-based, well, not even company, just I guess foreign location. Maybe it was a
Yeah.
foreign company, maybe it wasn't. And it was under whatever $800, something like that. I think you didn't pay. You just paid whatever the sticker price was, and that was that, right? Just
Yeah.
I don't. And someone told me of an experience a couple of months ago of ordering something. It was a couple $100s, and it was. I don't think this person even knew where it was coming from. It was just a web. You just ordered something. It was a young woman that she liked, and suddenly she gets a bill when it's delivered to her for an additional $40 or $50, which would be the
Yeah.
tariff on Canada was that 20, 25%, something like that, right at the time. And it was sort of like, and also, and very apologetic, both the website, but also the actual delivery guy was like, I mean, we didn't know, I think she said something like, well, shouldn't you have told me this when I was ordering it? And it was like, well, we didn't know. I guess
Yeah.
when did the tariffs are applied on the moment of, I don't know what, delivery or shipping or something like that. And they weren't sure if it was going to stay or not. And so the level of just, I mean, you do wonder if there aren't going to be more and more of these stories. I guess
Yeah.
now they know sort of for a while until it changes, but Trump's changing it still all the time. So I feel like, yeah, the uncertainty side of it should at some point hit politically a little bit. People don't like that, do they? I don't know.
Yeah, but it's, this is one of the reasons why tariffs are so politically seductive is that they're mainly hidden. So, the de minimis is an exception to the general rule
Right.
that we consumers, we don't typically get a
See
tax
it.
bill, right?
Right.
And so, I don't know how much of that de minimis tax bill thing will end up happening because now that they've shut it down, I think a lot of retailers are simply going to stop doing it instead of there will be edge cases like your friend, and then Business Insider had a great piece of people complaining on social media about these big tax bills they were getting because of their de minimis stuff. But I think I think that'll be pretty
Right.
minor. And otherwise, the way that consumers are going to be feeling this is going to be through mainly invisible price hikes.
Yeah.
Companies don't like to telegraph price increases, even when they're not their fault, right? And they like to try to encourage people to get in before the tariffs hit, right? And they do all these,
Right.
or they can spread it out over a lot of goods, and so they try to hide these things. And so the at the end of the day, yes, you're going to be able to maybe go back a year and notice that your coffee suddenly you were buying it from Amazon for $10 a container to now it's 12 or 13. So if you do some sleuthing, you'll be able to figure this out. But I don't expect there to be a ton of direct consumer backlash just because they're not seeing it, which is again why politicians love tariffs, right?
Yeah.
They get soaked up in the supply chain, and they, of course, only go after foreigners, supposedly. You don't see the invisible price increases that domestic producers implement because they have, less competition. And so that makes it harder for consumers to get mad about this. But we could end up in a situation where it's December, January, and the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and or the personal consumption expenditures index, what the kind of general inflation metrics have popped up. And so maybe people notice the just everything's a little more expensive now, and they can tie that back to the president's signature initiatives. But I think it'll be really hard on kind of a one-off basis.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, Trump's also so pretty shrewd about some of the stuff, and he might just decide, wouldn't he get a lot of credit or get a lot of attention if he's, you know what, I'm putting back the de minimis, I've changed it, I'm making it X amount instead. It's much better, 1,000 instead of 800.
Well,
And why
this,
won't he do that? Incidentally, I think it's so obviously politically like an easy thing to do. It probably isn't that much money ultimately, and it would be heralded by everyone. I mean, I'm sort of surprised that is one where I think Congress probably could get 67 votes. I mean, people really want everyone to be paying it, every small business to be paying like on $80 purchases. I mean, a tariff.
Yeah, but I'm pretty sure this is also subject to litigation right now because de minimis exception, the de minimis rule was set by Congress.
Right. It's not made up.
Yeah. This is not just an administrative thing. It's not a regulatory thing. So for the president to just simply end it is an abuse of power, pretty clearly. And so just so people know, the de minimis exception originated but based on foreign tourism. We used to travel abroad. You'd come back from Mexico with your tequila or sombrero, and they didn't want to like make you have to fill out customs forms for that stuff, right? And so for a long time, you could always come back and declare up to a certain value.
Yeah, they remember she would check off in the old days when you had physical forms they gave you on the airline when you flew back into the country, and you've checked off, I have goods that are less than $1,200. I can't remember what it was, and you therefore don't have to declare anything at customs. Now, if they didn't believe you, they could still ask you to, open your suitcase and make sure you didn't have hidden in there some extremely fancy something or other. But in principle, yes, you could bring. They wanted you. They didn't want to bother you with it, and they didn't even want to discourage you, I suppose, particularly.
Exactly.
I
mean, so the reason for that, and for then why they expanded it, is the administrative burden of this stuff is massive. I mean, it's a tiny amount of revenue, and compliance costs on both sides are huge. So just forget about it, right? So Congress expanded the exemption to apply to e-commerce for the same reason. They said, look, a bunch of rich people can go to Europe and bring back an Hermes scarf or whatever, and they don't have to pay a tariff on it. But if you were to import it directly or anything else, right, you have to pay a tariff and go through the customs formalities. That's ridiculous. So with the rise of e-commerce, they just said, okay, everybody direct to consumer, whether it's via traveling or just sitting at home and clicking, you can do this. And a bunch of companies, most famously Shein and Temu from China, but tons of others, saw this and started utilizing it. A bunch of American businesses saw it and started utilizing it. And Congress, in a law, changed it. So for Trump to just simply eliminate it via executive action is something ripe for litigation. And I wouldn't be surprised to see it return because of that. There's not a clear justification for just terminating it outright.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to get to sort of some of the regional effects, or the China, Canada, some of the particular areas where we're having to get your sense of what is happening and what might happen, and also the kind of, let's call it, the indirect and contagion effects, as you put it elsewhere, and of tariffs. It's not just the direct effect. It's what could lead, what cycle could we be launching here? But before we get into that, just one thing, I was thinking about the politics for it as you were speaking. I mean, I guess one other reason it hasn't hit yet, if I can put it that way, politically, it doesn't seem to have. I mean, they're pretty unpopular tariffs, I'd say, actually, more than they were a couple of years ago. So in that respect, it's hit a little. I do think the opposition party doesn't seem to be making a big deal of it, both in general, or when they do, it's very general. And again, this is fine. It's legit economics, but we think prices will go up. The CPI is going to go up. It'll be a bit of a drag, more of a bit of a drag on the economy, and so forth. But they haven't done a very good job, in this case, the Democrats, for example, of saying, look, hamburger, I think this is true, you'll correct me, hamburger is like 10% more, meat is 10% more expensive on average than it was, I think, when Trump became president. These things are subject to a million causes, of course. But in this case, we import a lot of beef from, I think, Brazil, I guess, and Mexico, among other places. And Brazil is particularly a place where, with which we have a trade surplus, incidentally, where Trump has slapped on this massive tariff because he doesn't like the fact that they're prosecuting Bolsonaro, who tried a coup. So literally, because that's not even like a fake economic decision. That's
Yeah.
just Trump doesn't like what the government's doing, and because of that, you're paying more for your burgers on Labor Day. It feels like if I were a Democrat, I think I could make that argument pretty easily. And it's sort of like
Yeah.
eggs. Wasn't that the thing with Biden? You know, the kind of example of the inflation. The Democrats are so wrapped around the axle. You know, they make the macroeconomic arguments. They're very convinced Medicaid's a winning argument, which is fine if it is, but you know, it probably is one. But they never seem to make the kind of very direct argument to consumers that you are buying this, and this is more expensive. And it's not just more expensive because of random things. It's partly more expensive because of actual things that Donald Trump has done
And
in a willful way.
intentionally making things more expensive. See, I think that's the real key. And I agree with you that it's been a disappointment that the Democrats haven't hit this more. This is not, and I had a ton of issues with some of the spending during the Biden era and some of the things they did. I do think it contributed to some of the
Right.
inflation that we experienced. But it wasn't
Right.
intentionally
That was an effect
designed.
of other
Right. It was
policies.
they were
Right.
trying to do this other stuff, and I didn't want them to do that other stuff, but it wasn't, I'm trying to increase prices. The president is literally trying to increase prices. Tomatoes, I think, is a great example of this. This is not one of Trump's main tariff things, but the Trump administration just terminated an agreement with Mexico related to anti-dumping duties on Mexican tomatoes. Well, we get a lot of tomatoes from Mexico. Big shock, because in our winter months we don't grow a lot of tomatoes, and because a lot of the tomatoes we do grow in the out of the real peak season are like garbage tomatoes. So we import a lot of tomatoes from Mexico. Comparative advantage. Let's hear for it. No, they terminated the agreement, so we should expect to see tomato prices go up this fall, and this is the intended result of the policy. And you can pinpoint dozens of examples just like this, and not just food. And I think one of the reasons why Democrats haven't been better on this is that there's this continued split in the Democratic Party about trade and just in general kind of the future, right? You have kind of the neoliberal side of things, and then you have the progressive populist side. And the progressive populists, I think, have more um, they have better PR. They're on TV a lot more. Elizabeth Warren being kind of the ultimate example of this. And these folks just aren't going to. They're very much union aligned. They're classically protectionist. They have been forever. And you combine that with some of the uh, just knee-jerk protectionism from folks like Chuck Schumer, who's just been that's been his thing for a long time. And I think that you create this area where a guy like Tim Kaine, he actually is out there saying these things, but is anybody hearing it? No, because nobody's listening. They're listening to Liz Warren and Bernie. Um, but the other thing, of course, is that you can't get a coherent message. The classic example of this is, I forget the guy's name, but a young representative, Democratic representative from Pennsylvania, wrote an op-ed about how actually tariffs are good. And then the DNC, whatever like amplified it on X, and everybody's like, what are you doing? Right.
Right.
And that, I think that split is muting what should be an absolutely slam dunk thing. Because if you look, like you said, you look at the polling on tariffs, they are not popular. Even among Republicans, they're not really popular. Um, Inflation remains the number one issue for voters overall, not just among economic issues. Overall, prices are the number one issue. And you can pinpoint examples of the White House saying they want to increase prices. It's not that it doesn't take this is not 3D chess. This is checkers, right?
Right.
So I would like to see more of it. It just hasn't happened. Now I will caution, and I say this every podcast. Look, the U.S. economy is massive. It's mainly services oriented, and in, people in the trade space are doing everything they can to mitigate the damage here. So tariffs aren't economic Armageddon, and they aren't even going to bring back the inflation we saw in 2020 2021, 2022. They're just going to make everything a little bit worse. They're going to make prices a little bit higher. So that's the other thing that I think makes this a difficult issue for politicians who like to talk in hyperbole and very black and white. That you have to be a bit more measured in how you speak of this, because if you don't, you end up with exactly what we had 2 weeks ago, which was we had a string of rather tepid inflation and other economic reports that didn't show much tariff effects. And you had Republicans and Trump and the MAGA sphere all gloating. Aha, see, you claimed the sky would fall and it didn't. And those of us who say, no, actually, we never said the sky would fall, it doesn't matter, right? Because there were people out there saying the sky is falling back in April. And that's you have to be really careful. Now, I will say at the macro level, we are starting to see tariff effects. And I think that's going to continue through the fall. So I think there is going to be far more opportunities in, say, October, November, for Democrats to get this right and to point at some of the macro data as well. But so far, not so great.
Interesting. Let me ask two maybe final sets of questions, really, or set topics, really. One is, I mean, how worried, and take them whichever order you want. One is how worried should one be about indirect and particularly contagion effects, or
Yes.
like the cycle, this launching something that gets out of control. People were pretty concerned back in April with Liberation Day. I think that Trump pulled back some. People like Bessent seem to have some influence on him and maybe preventing it from getting too crazy. But it's a complicated world out there, and and I'm just curious how much these things, how
Yeah.
how much one can be confident that's not going to happen, or what would make you worried that it was happening? Maybe that's another way of putting it.
Right.
And then secondly, related actually, but separate, is just some of the big picture, China, the stuff with Canada and Mexico, the EU.
Sure.
I mean, there's big geopolitical questions about why we should be antagonizing our allies, and we're trying to get to do more in Ukraine. But that's leaving that aside almost, just from a sort of economic point of view. What are the big places you're looking at to see where we're going in this area?
Yeah. So, the way that I like to think about tariff effects is three levels. There's direct effects, there's indirect effects, and then this kind of contagion, unknowable contagion, right? And I think what the sell-off in April, stock sell-off in April was everybody thinking worst case scenario. You're going to get highest US tariffs with no exceptions. Because you got to remember at the time, everybody in the White House was saying, no, Trump is 100% serious. He's not backing down. No exemptions, no exceptions. This is it. You had foreign governments saying, we're going to retaliate. And it really did look like the wheels were potentially falling off, particularly as you had foreign investors pulling out of the dollar, doing a lot of stuff. You saw treasury rates spiking. So that wasn't direct effects. So as we already said, the direct effects here are relatively small. Now, as you said, and as Jason Furman just wrote a great piece in the New York Times about, 0.2% of GDP is a lot, particularly when it's compounded over years. You're talking about, trillions of foregone economic output and thousands of dollars per household lost. But in the grand scheme of our economy, which is mainly driven by companies like NVIDIA or others that have a trade nexus, but not direct, right? And so we can do a lot of trade damage and it won't directly affect the economy. Now, indirect, that's different story. And this is where I think things get a little more complicated, because you're going to have companies like NVIDIA will have some trade implications because they need chips from all over the world. They have business abroad. But a lot of services companies that are just, domestically oriented services are going to have some effects. So one of the examples I always talk about is auto insurance. So auto insurance rates are going to go up because cars get more expensive and they get more expensive to repair. So the insurance guys have been really, really clear. Rates are going up. This is not a conspiracy. This is simply a very simple calculation that it's going to be more expensive for them to pay for your car.
Yeah, and that's interesting because they're not importing anything. They're just
No.
having to insure something whose prices got up. So it's an indirect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Hospitals talk about they're going to need to increase prices a bit because medical devices, PPE, of course, drugs as well. These are all going to go up a little bit. So they're going to have to, that, which might then ripple into your health insurance costs. So there's all these kind of indirect effects. Another big one is banks. So banks issue companies lines of credit. And if companies are trade oriented and they start to struggle, maybe a few banks start to struggle. Not, they don't collapse, but again, they're worse off. So there's all these kind of indirect effects that again, you're not thinking economic Armageddon still, but much bigger than simply oh, you're paying a little bit more for a tomato, right? And then finally, there's this other area of contagion, and that's where I think we just don't know. Um, if more governments had retaliated, um, then you would see some of this contagion, right? Because one of the reasons why tariffs are a problem is not because of their direct effects, but because other governments tend to retaliate. And China retaliated and Canada retaliated a little bit. But the surprising thing this time around is that other governments didn't. Wisely in terms of economics, but surprising in terms of their own politics and geopolitics. Maybe, though, we're 6 months down the road and Trump keeps screwing with tariffs, and finally the Europeans say, to heck with this. Or maybe new governments are elected in a year or whatever, and they say, and they get elected on we're going to go after Donald Trump. I mean, he's not that popular abroad. Other contagion effects that you just, do investors really start to worry about the US economy or the global economy? Do they worry about the Chinese economy, which is already a problem? And, these types of things can redound back to us in weird ways that we don't quite see. And so that doesn't strike me as the likely avenue, but it is one of the worries. And I think it's why everybody freaked out in April, was they were kind of looking at how this could actually kind of infect everything. Globalization is amazing, but we all are connected in various ways. And when China gets a cold, so do we. And that applies more broadly. And I think, then getting into your kind of last question
Well, and
about,
just, I mean, on the freak out in April, just, I mean, people have therefore assumed it's not going to happen, but it may also be that the freak out was a leading indicator or a possible indicator. You just don't know. I mean,
yeah,
people are
I
too quick to somehow say, because, and we've seen this in other parts of like stock market, this often happens, right? The thing starts plunge and then it bounces back and everyone
yeah,
uses a
this
big sigh of relief. But it turns out 20 years later, when they write the history of the stock market, that plunge was a bit of a, was uh, uh, yeah, a harbinger of what was to come. I'm not
right,
saying
right.
that's the
Yeah,
case. I'm
yeah,
just saying that's possible.
yeah, and I think right now stocks were too pessimistic in April. They seem too optimistic right now. Um, but again, when you have a stock market that's driven by a lot of companies that don't have direct trade exposure, it's hard to say.
But even on
But
that, just I have to look at the stock market numbers. So the market's up like, I don't know, 1%, 2% or something under Trump in Trump's presidency. I mean, it's up a
yeah,
tiny
yeah,
little bit this year, but not much. So you could, I mean, I would, who knows? It was up quite a lot actually before that under Biden. So maybe it needed a rest. Maybe it's good that it's stable at at a high level. On the other hand, you could also say you have a wildly pro-business administration. You have passed a tax bill, what everyone thinks of all of it, is presumably stimulative in terms of, investment in the markets, right? It's very friendly to business investment and lower taxes on the wealthy and stuff. And the market still hasn't gone up. I mean, I think
right.
in a normal world, if you gave all the data to an economist that we were just talking about, I've just mentioned, he'd probably say, yeah, the market probably should be up 7, 8, 12%, maybe pretty big rally.
It's
Trump's going to be there, Republican Congress, business is not going to have any of the problems it had, allegedly, at least under Biden and so forth. But so you could make a non-crazy argument that we're already paying, in a
oh
sense,
yeah.
for the tariffs and for the uncertainty in particular that surrounds the tariffs.
Yeah, no, and I think that goes back again to one of the really hard things about being a free trader, not just under Trump, but in general, is that when you talk about this stuff, you always have to talk about what would have happened but
Right.
for the tariffs or whatever. And that's what economists are paid to do, and we'll get those types of analyses eventually. But I think you're right that, Goldman Sachs has done a really great analysis looking at all the Trump proposals, good and bad. And there are some good, right? The tax bill, the ABABA, for all of its problems, had some really good business tax provisions in it, including this permanent full expensing for corporate investment. So Goldman looks at this and they chart it all out, and you can see that the growth effects overall are flat because the tariffs have canceled out all of the good stuff, the
Mm.
deregulatory stuff. So um, it's unfortunate in the sense for the economy that we didn't just do the good stuff. But and where would we be but for that? You would expect it to be better, right? But that's a really hard political thing
Right.
to sell, right?
Right.
You would be wealthier but for prices would be different but for that's very hard to get people. It's always like trying to teach people about opportunity costs in general is very hard. It's very easy to point to a factory and go, aha, look, we got a sock factory because of these tariffs. It's much harder to say, ah, yes, but what would those resources have done? But for, if they hadn't gone to the sock factory, where would they have gone? That's a harder thing to argue. But it is an important point to make.
Okay, so regional effects,
Yeah,
big countries,
sure.
China in particular. What give me
Yeah,
some sense of
so
that?
you know, Canada and Mexico have been somewhat spared by all of this because they got a big exception for quote USMCA related goods, which is Trump's trade agreement. This goes back to some of the uncertainty, though. Nobody knows exactly what qualifies for that exception. Back in the day, it was a very simple cost benefit analysis. You did the paperwork to qualify for USMCA if the tariff hit was big enough. But if it was only like a 2% tariff, you're just probably going to pay the tariff because it's so much easier. So now, though, importers and exporters have really rushed into this exception, and most trade is ending up back duty free.
Hmm.
So Canada and Mexico are seeing some effects, but nothing cataclysmic, because so much of this is now USMC related. Now that could change, right? Trump keeps threatening bigger tariffs here and there, and there's questions over automotive goods and questions over what qualifies for that exception. But so far they're okay. Um, China and Europe are in. I'll do China first. China is taking a hit because of the tariffs, but China's economy was already really struggling for a lot of non-Trump related reasons. A lot of them are things that I've been screaming about for a while. All that Chinese industrial policy that a lot of folks like to say is doing great has actually created a lot of overcapacity and a lot of resource misallocation and a lot of just wasteful subsidies and corruption and other things. And that's really been dragging on the Chinese economy. It's kind of going into deflation. But how much of this really matters for a Chinese regime that doesn't, you know, um, care
Right.
much, right? So um, China seems to be okay with everything right now, and a big reason for that is that China, instead of exporting to the United States, is just exporting to everybody else. And so China's exports, I think, are at all-time highs, or they're close at least. And one of the things the Trump administration is trying to do is go after Chinese content that ends up in a refrigerator from Vietnam or a European solar panel or whatever. So that's, I think, going to be a really interesting area to go forward. Do governments play ball with the Trump administration, or do they not? Like Malaysia has said, look, we can't do this. We're pretty dependent on the Chinese economy, but maybe some other governments do go along. So that's something to kind of keep a look, keep an eye on, and to see how Chinese trade affects. The Europeans are kind of in a rough spot because of Ukraine and other things. They really don't have a ton of leverage because of all the geopolitical stuff, and with a relatively weak economy. So they seem to be just playing for time. They're willing to accept this 15% tariff, willing to say they're going to liberalize certain things in their market, but good luck getting through the European bureaucracy. That could take a long time. So they're just kind of waiting things out. Maybe the courts will save them there. And then I think importantly, though, there are a lot of little economies that I think could be pretty devastating for them. Um, you know, We always talk about,
poorer countries.
yeah, like Lesotho, right? That is tiny and very poor, but had a thriving blue jean manufacturing industry that is suddenly on the verge of collapsing because of these threatened tariffs on imports from Lesotho, right? And there are a lot of countries like this out there that, their per capita GDP is under $1,000. I mean, they are really, really poor. They have one industry. They're doing kind of that classic export-led growth that developing countries do, for better or worse. And here, US tariffs that are high could just simply crush them. And I should note, they're not going to bring back jeans making to the United States. They're just going to shift it to other larger economies that either have tariff loopholes like Mexico, or are just giant like China and can just, they have the margins to handle the tariff better. So, one thing we saw during the Biden years was the elimination of this program called GSP that allowed for limited duty-free imports from a lot of very poor countries. And when that expired and wasn't renewed, which was very bad, um, companies that were making products in these places, they went back to China. They said, look, I used to make luggage in Sri Lanka or wherever. Now I'm going to make it in China because that's better for our margins. And so I think that's the inevitable outcome of these places. Those developing countries are going to get hurt. And it's not going to onshore this very low margin production of the United States. It's just going to move it to larger developing countries, which is not a win for anybody, except,
No,
the
it's very,
larger developing countries.
but it's an important point about the poor countries. I mean, it's really, it
Yeah,
really can be very damaging. We have some interest, presumably, in a sort of general humanitarian interest, but also a geopolitical interest in just generally not having,
right.
rampant
Well,
poverty and chaos in
yeah,
parts of
and
the African continent and elsewhere.
for those who are really worried about border security and illegal immigration from some of these places, there was a great study a couple of years ago that said that if you allowed for freer trade in apparel, you would have reduced illegal border crossings from Central America by tens of thousands of
Hmm.
of people. But and which right makes sense. I mean, if you make people wealthier, they have less incentive to flee and so forth. And so from both a global security perspective and a migration perspective, you have to wonder what unintended consequences are coming from this rather arbitrary tariff policy.
I mean, one last question. The Europeans in particular, I feel like they just decided, look, I mean, Trump does have a set, he's a bully. I think that's the way he thinks of life. Bullies prevail and the weak are there to be preyed on in various ways, personal and political and so forth. And, bullying does work in the short term often. I mean, that's just life, right? And so if you're Switzerland, you just say, I'm not going to, make a big fuss about this. Or if you're the EU, even, which is big, so not quite as easy to bully, but as you say, weak in other ways and dependent on us in very important ways. Look, it's not worth having, we'll take a little hit here. We're not going to. We still have to maintain the alliance and so forth. And Trump is already threatening to do other things there. And so I just generally want to assume, I don't know, basing a foreign policy on this kind of bullying working forever seems like a very dubious
Yeah,
proposition to me. I mean,
well, especially because, and this is something I've been clamoring about for a while now. All of these countries are not embracing protectionism amongst themselves, and so I think one of the longer term effects of these Trump years is much stronger trade ties among everybody else,
hmm,
both government to government and just private supply chains. You're seeing governments or companies develop this kind of America plus one strategy that they did with China for years, where you're going to have US centric production. It's going to be higher cost and less variety and whatever. And then you're going to have your everybody else supply chain. And that is going to make the United States a less integral player in the global economy, less influential in the long term, and quite frankly, poorer, right? I mean, we're going to kind of be this, if you look at like steel, for example, we pay the most in the world for steel. Everybody else has very cheap steel. So, how much are we going to do this for semiconductors? And we're going to do it for all these important inputs for food. Over the longer term, we'll be a little poorer and less influential. and everybody else will be a little wealthier, and we'll be on the outside looking in.
Yeah, that's a hell. America first, but America, it turns out, yeah, in this case would
Alone.
be America more alone, and therefore ultimately less well off internally as well. I would say, personally
Yeah,
saying, yeah,
and I'm a big fan of American soft power,
right.
and the to the extent that American goods and services and technology and culture are less relevant abroad, I think that can redound to other more geopolitical things, not just economic things.
Final point. I'm just guess or estimate or I don't know, likelihoods of where we'll be 6, 12, 18 months from now. Is it going to kind of look the way it is today? Sort of
Yeah.
a little hard to disentangle, maybe some slowing, some price cost. Is there a moment where you can look ahead and say this is likely to be a inflection point one way or the other? Trump will have decided this or that. I mean, how do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think the next 6 months are going to be a lot of more of the same in terms of tariff rates wildly fluctuating and changes almost daily. It's been an hour now. I'm sure some tariff has changed in the time we've been on recording. The I think that's going to continue. I think the other big thing that is going to be all this compliance stuff. People are starting to, now that their inventories are gone and they're starting to figure out this is the new reality. I think there's going to be a lot of companies that are struggling with what exactly they're paying, and I, enforcement is going to be an issue. Are we really going to see, not ICE raids, but customs and DOJ going after companies for? We've already seen a little of this, going after what they thought was legal, but turns out they were underpaying their tariff bill or that kind of stuff. And relatedly, I think we'll be seeing more smuggling and more illegal activity along these things. That wouldn't surprise me at all. 12 months, the court cases are the really big
Hmm.
thing. Um, we should have a final Supreme Court ruling on these biggest
Right.
tariffs. And that raises all the issues we discussed. But it also raises the issue of, will Trump be trying to court proof his tariffs by using other laws? Because you got to remember, the IEPA is the worst one, but there are 5 other laws out there that Trump could use to unilaterally piece back together his tariffs. It'd take a little longer, it wouldn't be as complete, but he could do it. So I think that's going to be a really big issue. If the federal circuit rules as people kind of think, at least in the oral arguments, and that would be against the tariffs, you might be in a situation where the Supreme Court is forced to get involved, and I think that could be really, really important and interesting. And then 18
But just on
months.
that, in the meantime, it would seem to me if there's like a, let's just say 50-50 chance, which actually could be right, that the Supreme Court would actually strike this down. Because I do think the interpretation of this particular law, IEPA, I don't even know what it stands for. I used to know International Economic something.
Emergency Economic Powers Act.
Yeah. If they rule, if there's a reasonable chance they will against it, I think everyone who's thinking about premising certain decisions, purchases, but also investment, obviously here or abroad, on certain tariff regime, suddenly think, well, man, that could just go away,
Right.
and so in a weird way, even if it ends up in a place you and I prefer, more free market, more free trade place, it could temporarily paralyze economic activity a bit, right? I
Yeah.
mean, if
Yeah.
so it's kind of a
And
funny
it's
consequence.
a huge unknown for, and then the fiscal effects, right? Is all that money that Trump's bragging about? Where's
Right.
that? What's going to happen with that? The other thing over that 6 and 12 month period is we will be seeing more concrete data on tariff effects. It's just starting to trickle in. By the time January rolls around, most of the big investment banks and folks that are studying this say, well, the price effects will be in, and they expect a about 1 percentage point increase in the general price level, which is a lot, but not the 2022 inflation. GDP growth we expect to be slower. Manufacturing sputtering along. That's probably where we are. Is that enough to cause an uprising and Congress to actually do their job? I don't know.
No,
Um,
probably not.
and then 18 months, look, midterms, and that I think is going to be really, that's one of the things I really am interested. Are Democrats going to be actively campaigning against the tariffs? Or are they, given the schism we already talked about, kind of playing this both sides? Tariffs can be good in some cases, but I don't like these particular ones. That's not a very winning message. We'll just have to, that'll be, I think, really interesting to watch.
Yeah, and I would say just I mean, presumably this, it's possibly a bell curve of possibilities, and the kind of muddling through with some paying some price is the most likely. But the world often does sort of not quite settle there, right? It often kind of goes in one direction or another. I mean, I think people are a little too, I don't know. There's always more tail risk than people think, and
Yeah,
that
and other things always pop up, right? That's the other thing you have to think about. What if we have a recession for, I mean, not
other.
tariff related reasons, but the economy isn't looking great, and it hasn't been looking great for a little while, not just because of tariffs. What if that happens? What if there's a big conflagration or some problem, a real big problem in China or elsewhere? There's all these types of things that can happen. It's impossible to say, oh yeah, that's
Well, and
definitely
also if there is a recession, does it lead people to say, "Oh my God, we really can't mess around with these tariffs anymore. We have to go back to the preceding regime," or does it say they have the opposite effect? I believe the
right,
last time
right.
we had a big depression, it led to the opposite. It led to people putting on tariffs, not taking them off,
Right.
right?
And the pandemic, we talked before, the knee-jerk reaction during the pandemic was to onshore more stuff, right?
Right.
People, when things are bad, people actually want more protection, even though economically that's not the best thing to do. So yeah, there's a lot of unknowns outside of the trade space.
Well, we'll have to get back together in 6 months at least and discuss
Yeah.
this. And then again in 12. No, this has been very, very interesting. And I really thank you for coming. But also the focus on the administrative burdens, what it's really like for the producers and consumers. It's been very helpful, I think. But so much of the discussion has been at the macro level, which again is a legitimate discussion as well. It's just I think it's been less of this. So, Scott, thanks for joining me today. It's really been great.
My pleasure.
And thank you all for joining us on Conversations. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Your interest in this program means a lot to me. I appreciate it.